Welcome to episode 170 of Stageworthy. I'm your host, Phil Rickaby. Stageworthy is a podcast about people in Canadian theatre featuring conversations with actors, directors, playwrights, and more. Guys, I have a couple of pet peeves in terms of things that theaters do. Two of my main pet peeves are emails and trailers. I could talk about trailers for a long time because generally I don't think theater makes good trailers. For the most part. There are a couple of exceptions, but generally not good trailers. So I could go on about that quite a bit. But I want to mention another pet peeve, which is emails. And I'm not talking about promotional emails that I get. Those are more than welcome. I'm talking about mailing lists and the way that theaters subscribe you. Now, for a while there, we were getting a lot better. The Canadian government introduced the Canadian anti-spam legislation, or CASL, and for a while there, we were doing a great job about not adding people to mailing lists when they didn't want to be added. But lately, I've been seeing a few theaters that have not been following that. Somehow I get on their mailing list because I purchased tickets and I did not see a consent form on there. That is actually not cool. It's way not cool to subscribe somebody without explicitly asking them to opt in. It's basically not compliant with CASL. Boring for everybody else, but frustrating for me. I know. If you're running a theater and you're doing this, please stop. It's not good, and it makes people angry at you, which is not a great way to build a relationship with people. So that's my little rant for today. If you want to respond to that, if you have something to say about that, you can always find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StageworthyPod. The website is stageworthypodcast.com. And if you want to drop me a line, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby. And my website is philrickaby.com. My guest this week is Franco Nguyen, writer and performer of Good Morning, Viet Mom, which opens February 19th and runs until March 3rd at Aki Studio in Toronto.
What can you tell me about Good Morning, Viet Mom, just to get started?
Well, I think it's like a very personal. Everything is it's like a very real show. It's about my relationship with my mom and how I go back to Vietnam for the first time, and my mom goes back to Vietnam for the first time in 28 years. And it's in the show, it's like funny, so it's a combination of stand-up and video that I shot of my multiple times going back to Vietnam, along with like personal photos and home video. And so it's this very real personal exploration about this relationship with my mom and this introduction to this new world that I've heard about, but I never really saw before, which was what Vietnam, specifically Suc Trang, more specifically the village of Long Duc, where my mom is from. And it's a funny show, but it's also like an emotional journey. And I think that's part of the reason why the comedy is there, is to help because it's so real. The comedy kind of breaks the tension and adds a little bit of levity to get us through the show.
I do sort of feel like comedic moments sort of set you up. Like, from a mechanical point of view, you can sort of dangle funny at people for a while and then pull the rug out from under them in a way that they're not expecting.
Yeah, I think it's like, it works both ways, right? Like, when you're really present, that's when you're really discovering things. And for comedy, it usually starts out as because the structure that we sit in the theater, it's not a very natural thing. And so if I look at you and I say something that is very present, then all of a sudden, okay, we're all here together. Okay, so now we're all here together. We've all laughed together. So the laughter has brought us together. We're all linked together. We're all connected. Now we can move together. And in our movement through the story or through my movement on stage, that's where we discover things. So even throughout all the shows, something will happen where I will say something. Like one time in one of the videos, my Vietnamese is really bad. And there was a woman who spoke Vietnamese, and she was laughing really hard because in the scene, the video that she sees, it's my mom getting her citizenship. And one of the questions that the immigration official asked my mom is, can you ask her if she has any police charges? And then I translate, and my Vietnamese directly translated is, I asked my mom, did the police ever catch you or anything like that? That's because my grasp of Vietnamese is very limited. So there's this woman that was sitting at the front, and she was just dying laughing. And I looked at her and I'm like, there's no way this show is going to get any funnier for her. Like, no one has enjoyed the show as much as her.
No.
So, and on the reverse, it's like, sometimes something that's really funny, we assume that the comedy we're going to be staying in this emotion. And then we are revealed something else, and it's like, wow, that's a huge, like when you see Toy Story, you don't think they're all going to join hands and, accept death, you know?
No, you don't.
Yeah.
It's what's the word? It's undermining your expectations in a way that, and of course, a lot of those, that's one of the things about those Pixar stories and those other Disney movies is you don't know, you think, oh, it's just a kid's thing. It's going to be all light, and then it isn't.
Yeah. And that's like the thing I'm realizing too. Like, even like I'm having, like even as a kid, I was very sensitive, and I would like play outside on the ground and would look closely at the grass and like really touch sand and stuff. And even watching kids play now, like my partner's nieces and nephews, they are very sensitive to the world. And I'm having a baby in July. And so in those, like with Pixar, or like especially in like the Studio Ghibli movies, it's like the sense of the world is it's just everything is important, you know, and the sensitivity is so high. And I don't know, I think it's like there's something about when we're in the theater and it's quiet, and all of a sudden you can say something and everyone feels it, and they're really in tune with it. And I think when you, I don't know, it's interesting because like I come from a comedy background, so I'm always just used to anytime someone says something, they always kind of naturally try to break the tension with a joke. So there have been times where I've been to like very serious meetings, and people are very serious, and it's very businesslike, and it's about the Q1 numbers, and I'm just like, man, this guy needs to throw in a punchline at some point.
Yeah. But we as humans are often uncomfortable with those very serious moments, and so that's why we'll undercut, like, it'll be like, the numbers are really terrible.
Yeah.
In this quarter. Somebody's going to get fired. That's supposed to be a joke, but it's like you don't want to be quite as serious about such bad news.
Yeah.
Right? We always want to undercut it, and sometimes in theater we have to sit in it in a way that's like that's necessary, but where it's so uncomfortable. Right?
Yeah. I think, it's just whatever for my show. I think I just hesitated saying my show because in a way it's not just my show, like my mom is in like 40% of the show is my footage of my mom. And then there's a whole team of people adding their flavor to the show. But in this show, it's, I don't know. It like, we're just, the tension, I think we try to make sure that every moment is truthful and honest.
Yeah.
So if it's uncomfortable, then that moment is supposed to be uncomfortable. But I think it's like, I don't know. I think it makes you feel a little bit more alive because, when I think before I went to Vietnam, I didn't really know what to expect. I had heard stories about it. I heard there was poverty, but I didn't really know what the texture was like and what the colors were like. And, and I didn't know how much joy there was there. So, and then at the same time, it was very sad. It was very emotional. It was very overwhelming. So, and I think for the show, you have to feel everything because we're trying to find the answer to something. And whether or not you find it by the end of the show, at least the conversation is going somewhere. Yeah. And at least the conversation is open and honest. And I think if it's like, if like the boss at like my old Rogers job and he's gathering all the salespeople around and he's like, man, if he's like, the Q1 numbers are done, but good news, we all get to go home early. At least that like, it's like, we're not all crazy. Like at least he understands us. And I think that's what people are seeking when they look for story is like they're looking for balance and understanding. And
what was, the story is about, this trip that you took to Vietnam for the first time and with your mom and the first time in 20 years. What made you want to turn that into a play?
I think there's like a deeper reason, I think. Like a we go. Yeah, I guess we have time. Yeah. At home, my parents, my name is Yo. But when my dad registered me for school, my brother's name is Yung, but it's spelled D-U-O-N-G. So, people read it as Dong.
Yes.
And, I say that, in my act that, Dong and Yung in Vietnamese means strong and virile. And in English, it means poop, right?
Yeah.
So, and especially, at that time, like a lot of, kids of immigrants can say this, racism is kind of exponential. Like my experience, like the 2 years that my brother's 2 years older, but his experience with racism is a little bit more devastating than my experience. But anyways, because my dad had registered, I really believe that because my dad registered me as Franco and not Yo, it had a huge impact on how people treated me. So a lot of times it would be like, oh, Franco, that's an interesting name. That's it. Or sometimes people would be like, that's an interesting name. What's your real name? And I'd be like, it's Franco, I think. But because there's always a reaction, right? It's not people bullying me when they hear my name. They're interested or they're surprised or like, so then also at home, my parents were like, I had constantly arguing, like the police would come. So it was like, and plus my parents are Vietnamese, so I can't really talk to my mom in that way. Plus I'm also like her baby, so I'm also treated like a baby. So when I went to school, it's kind of like having this completely new identity. Right. All of a sudden I'm Franco at school. I'm weird, like, oh, unusual. Oh, your name. So then, because at home it's so, tumultuous, but at school it's like fun. It's social. I'm like this different person. So I remember my first big laugh was they were doing this like 5th grade, and they were doing a safety, demonstration for bike safety. And it was, the safety instructors are like, oh yeah, and make sure you have to stop at a stop sign when you're on your bike. And then I shouted out, I was like, even if you have training wheels? And then it crushed. Like people were laughing so hard, and I was like, man, this is it. So
and from then on, you're like, I need this.
I need that. I'm chasing this dragon now. And so, but I think it's also that, like, even at that time, I knew I was different, because people were saying, oh, you look like a Franco. So, and then I also knew that my parents were very sad all the time.
Yeah.
And they were always worried about money, and my mom was always worried about people back home in Vietnam. So eventually I went to, like, even when I was graduating high school, we had to choose our courses. I was like, I wanted to kind of go to theater school and be an actor, but I was like, that's, that is an immigrant parent's nightmare. I should be doing something practical. And then I was like, I'm going to go to film school. Slightly more practical.
Than
Yeah,
theater, yeah.
less crazy, but still kind of crazy. So when I went to film school, I was making very serious films, but I was digging really deep, and I was looking for the truth of how I felt about my feelings and of the world, or my world that I knew. And I think, and naturally, after film school, I started doing stand-up, and naturally I just talk about my upbringing. And then I went to Vietnam, and then I had an opportunity to put on a show because I entered the Fringe lottery, and I was like, oh God, I have to do a show now.
When you entered the Fringe lottery, were you like, if I'll worry about that when I cross, like, what made you want to join enter the Fringe lottery?
Well, when I did I started stand-up, and then I was in film school. I was doing my master's in film. I had already graduated, so when I was doing stand-up, I was always thinking like, I could maybe use some of this footage maybe one day. So, once I got into the Fringe festival, I was definitely thinking, oh God, I have to do the show. But a part of me was like, I had this idea of a show in my head a little bit.
Yeah.
And I still felt like, oh God, I have to do a show. But I was like, this is destiny. I'm supposed to do it. I should be doing it. I wouldn't have gotten it if I wasn't supposed to be. And yeah, that was my thought process.
And so, how did the show evolve? Like, a lot of people, what was the process of creating the show? Like, here you are, you've got this slot in the Fringe. Did you just sort of did you create a script by talking? Did you write it? How did you do it?
The main thing was, because I was at York, I was trying to make a documentary about going back to Vietnam. But what had happened, I noticed, was when I would show people the footage, which is very intense. It's like footage of like my mom interacting with my grandmother who was very sick, or like there's footage of my mom seeing my grandmother for the first time, and it's very intense, and there's so much crying, as you can imagine, like not seeing someone for 28 years, and it's your own mother, and she doesn't remember who you are. But when I would show the footage to people, I don't think generally people weren't really connected to it. It was like when I would tell them about the project, people were like, wow, that's really profound. Yeah. But then if I didn't have any spiel before it, people would watch the footage and really just not connect to it. And so the process for the show was, I have all this footage and it really means a lot to me, and it's very hard for me to watch right now. But why is it hard for me to watch? But and for other people, it's just, people are very indifferent in their reactions to it. And also I had like all these jokes I started writing that were like, I think these are really funny. But because I started stand up at the same time when I went to Vietnam for the first time, a lot of my jokes were about going to Vietnam. So then I was like, okay, well, now I have these jokes that are funny and I have this footage that's funny. And I was like, maybe I just have to like contextualize it. And just even simply saying like, why? Okay, in this footage, it's my mom getting a citizenship thing and she's smiling. Okay, well, who cares, right? Yeah. To the average person. Well, it's important because this was, 2009, and she was getting her citizenship to go to Vietnam. Okay, well, anyone can get their citizenship. Yeah, but my mom's different because she didn't really speak English, so she's worked really hard to get it. Yeah, but a lot of people, okay, well, my parents were fighting a lot, and my dad was kind of abusive. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, yeah, but a lot of people's dads, okay, well, the thing is also, on top of that, she had left Suc Trang, Vietnam, to come to Canada. Well, there's still a lot, and so now it becomes like a crazy story. And then just putting it in order and my relationship with it. And at the time, the story also starts with, I live with my mom, and so it's like I also feel like I want to be protective of my mom. She babies me, but I also feel like I want to protect her. Mm-hmm. So then it's like there's a funny dynamic there, but also very frustrating. And so we explore that in the show as well. Yeah.
How was it doing a show? I mean, the Toronto Fringe, I don't know how much your parents knew about the Fringe at the time. Mm-hmm. And you, of course, had no idea that it would become a success at the Fringe. You just were doing it. How did your mother feel about being so featured in this show at the time? It's
funny because this is kind of indicative of how she perceives me still. Because a lot of the show was like, I was very excited. I was excited, but extremely nervous for her to see it because I was like, man, she's in it a lot. There's moments where she's very vulnerable. Like there's moments where she's crying in the footage. I hope she doesn't feel embarrassed or anything like that. And she's watching the show and she comes to the show and she's so loud talking throughout the whole show. No. She's like she doesn't, I could imagine this is probably her only theater show that she's been to. Yeah. But my brother sat next to her. I was like, oh, for the English parts, kind of whisper and translate for her. And my mom, I could just hear my mom in the left, just like talking throughout the show. And then just like, she'd be saying stuff like, oh, he's moving to the left now. Like, I'm just like, I'm a grown up. So, and then there's like a big monologue in the show that's very intense and like emotional. But like my mom was laughing because I just don't know why. I don't know why. I think she just thought it was like cute that she's like, oh, it's like a dog trying to act, like while wearing a hat, like, oh, he's doing big boy stuff. Oh, no. And so it was, I think she's always been someone, like, cause I'm the first person in my lineage to ever go to a post-secondary school. Okay. Like everyone else on her side, like it's from Suk Trang, this like farm area, rural area. And so for her dream for me was to just work indoors in an office, cause that's the idea of like, oh man, you've made it if you don't have to carry sugar cane across a field or like work in a factory like me. So I think for her to see me do something and see other people come to the show, it kind of helped her a little bit because I think before that she was definitely worrying a lot. Sure. But I think it's also like, I think she hears other things about other people in Viet communities that like are in, like sometimes people join gangs and whatnot. And I think she was always worried that I would fall into that, like very worried. Whereas like, especially like sometimes I would do so many, sets, comedy happens at night. So I'd be doing open mics and she'd be like, where were you? Oh, I'm so worried. And I'm like, I was just working on this bit about centaurs. Yeah. Just like, I know you've been doing heroin. I'm like, no, I'm just bombing. Just bombing all over the city.
It's worse, Mom.
Yeah, it's worse. Comedy. Yeah. It's a different type of drug. I wish I was doing heroin. Yeah.
So, I mean, you sort of mentioned that at one point you were thinking about going into theater school when you were finishing high school. What were you doing any theater before that? Like, what was it that made you consider theater school at the end of high school?
I always had so much fun in drama class, and I was in the high school play, and we had our own little improv club, which is like I've been studying improv comedy since, and the improv that we did was very much Wild Wild West style of improv, pure blocking all the time. I think the thing that, so I was really into theater, I was really into acting, but I think, a part of it too was like, I didn't have the self-esteem. I didn't think it was a possibility for me. I was like, oh, I could probably work in the background of something. Like I could figure out how to operate something. I could edit something, but I didn't think I could, I really did feel like if I auditioned, I would not get anything.
So instead, you just didn't. You went to theater. You went to film school.
I went to film school, and I didn't. I think I nervously had an audition for Ryerson. And I just never showed up, and I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna do it. So, and then even before that, I wanted to do stand up, and I went to Spirit's open mic, Joanne Downey's room, and it was like such a hot room, and you would have to email ahead of time. And then you would show up, and if you liked the show and she liked you, she would book you like a few months later. So I go to the show, and everyone's just so good. And I'm like, I could never do this. And then I just didn't do it. But like, I would secretly write. I would secretly write in this binder, and I would write so many jokes in this big, thick white binder. And one time, my friend Julian was like, "Oh man, let me hear one of your jokes, read from the book." And I was like, "Nah, man, it's not ready." He's like, "Man, you're the funniest person I know. Let me hear it." I'm like, "All right." And I read like my best joke in the binder, and he's like, "Okay." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm definitely not going to Spirits now."
With that kind of self-esteem and that thing, that you, like, how did you eventually overcome that to actually start doing stand-up and comedy?
I think, the reason why I did it was because I was at Starving Artists at Lansdowne and Bloor, and there was an open mic there, and it said email if you want to do it, and I emailed the thing. Oh, and before that, I was finding actors for a short film of mine, and I went on Mandy.com, and when I was on there, I saw an audition post for this sketch troupe called Asian Exploitation, which is where I met Daryl and Byron, who are part of Soaring Skies Collective. Byron is the director of this run of the show, and Daryl is the dramaturge. Excuse me. We'll edit that out. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I see. No, we're gonna keep it real. So yeah, and then I auditioned for that troupe just on a whim, and then we were a troupe for I was in that troupe for I think like 6 years, and then. Yeah, my friend, Daryl has always been super sweet and super supportive. And I'd always be like, "Man, I kind of want to do comedy." He's like, "Man, you got to do it, man. Like, you already have a voice. You just go out there and do it." And then I was like, "Oh, okay." And then he came to my first open mic. So he's, I think I'm only even realizing this now. But he was a huge, very supportive voice. And I think now I'm only realizing this now, but maybe I would have eventually done stand-up, but I think it would have happened a lot later if Daryl didn't encourage me.
What was it like that first time?
Man,
do you remember any of it?
I do. I went there. It is a small room. I had a little paper on me. Natasha Henderson was hosting, and I had like point forms of my jokes, and I would deliver my jokes very Stephen Wright style, monotone, and I don't know if any of the jokes hit. And I think my last joke was like, I think my bed is like a time machine because when I fall asleep, I wake up in the future. And I'm like, at the time I was like, this is gold. And it just was nonsensical, but I think people liked how it looked and thought there was something charming about and also there's always a charm of someone doing something for the first time. Sure, everyone's just like, I want to see what happens. So that's how it was so fun, and it was such a high because it was something I wanted to do. It's like, imagine that feeling you get when you submit your taxes or your last essay in school and times that by 1,000. Like, it was so good. And
so even though you don't really know if the audience, you can't remember if the audience was laughing or anything, or
what happens is like you listen back to your sets, right, from years ago, and at the time I thought I crushed. Like at the time I thought people were like amazed everyone wanted to sign me or something, but I think the reality was it was just very quiet and just the adrenaline was just bringing me so much joy. Yeah.
And you kept at it. And
I think, and it's like, stand-up is like anything. The thing is, with stand-up, people see you fail on the job. So, when you watch a film, it's it's already done.
Yeah.
Like, you don't watch the rough cut of the film. You don't watch the assembly cut. You don't watch, if you saw movies before they were mixed, you'd be like, man, this is unshowable.
Yeah.
But once they throw in all those elements on top of it, then it's like, wow, this is, even the bad ones are like really pretty decent compared to the rough cuts. Yeah. And some, even the great, like, you know, imagine the Avengers without the special effects. You're like, good God.
Like, what is this?
It's just green screen.
Yeah.
So with stand-up, it's like, yeah, sometimes you look like the Avengers and sometimes you look like a green screen. You know?
In a way, theater's like that too, though.
Yeah.
Right? Because even you can rehearse as much. You can rehearse all the time in the world, and you're going to have off days. You're going to have good days. And, and you know, sometimes we'll blame it on the audience. It's never really their fault.
Yeah.
And you know, when you have a bad day and you're just on autopilot, it shows. You know.
Yeah, I think that's because I also was at Second City on the touring. I did the education company, and I was on the touring company most recently. And yeah, you definitely when you've done the material that's rehearsed and you know the lines, then the audience can sense when you're not present or when you're present. And I think it's that thing where the liveness, the danger of it is really exciting for people. It's so primal and unconscious. Like in improv, I always say this, it's like this bit always kills, where there's two performers on stage. And at some point, you'll probably see this like one every 70 improv shows. At some point, a server will drop a glass, or a patron will drop a glass, and they'll make a shattering noise. And then there's a moment in the room where everyone's like, oh no, it interrupted the show. What's what do we do now? Do we look at here? Like, people are very jarred. And then the improviser will pretend, let's say they're holding a glass, and they'll just go, whoa, and then they pretend they dropped the glass that actually just dropped, so that, and people are like, oh my gosh, they know what's going on, we're so safe right now, they're smart, they're geniuses. But I think a lot of like comedy sometimes is, especially when you get bigger crowds, it's just having the courage and bravery to say what is happening. And that's why we see, you know, there's comedians that are some problematic, but for a lot of people it's like, wow, this person has the guts to just say what their impulses are. They can articulate their impulses, and so people are very drawn to like that danger. You know,
one of the I mean, if you're doing a theater show and you have a cast of people with you, if you're not having your best night, the rest of your cast can sort of pick you up and sort of like help you get back on track. When you're doing a solo show, if you're having an off night, it can be very difficult to do that to yourself. What do you find that the work that you did in stand-up, that there are things that you can rely on to help you come back to the moment?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's with stand-up, you have to be present a lot of the times, and it's like you're just aware of the audience. Like I've had shows where there's hecklers and you have to disarm. And like one time I was in Kitchener, and even before the show, the manager said to the hosts, okay, this person has drank a lot, you might want to watch out for them. And then in my mind, I was like, why don't you just ask him to leave now? But, of course, like I think I went on, third. And by that time, this person is way more belligerent. And I think I was just, I was like, I don't remember what I said, but I said at some point, the audience was in shock because I said something along the lines of like, something like, oh, I wish you weren't here either. But it sounded like I hope she was dead or something, right? Yeah. And everyone's like, and then like, because I knew that the audience was shocked, and I knew that this was the context of a comedy show, and I knew that, you know, she's the one that's in the wrong here. then I just had to double down and just really be brave in that moment and just be really crass. And I was like, no, actually what I mean is I don't want her to be alive. And then that just won the crowd over because they're like, wow, like he's not polite. He'll be honest with us.
Yeah.
And then eventually they kicked that person out, which was like, great, awesome.
Yeah.
But with the theater show, and what happens with stand-up is like you really appreciate the audience because you like, especially when the comedians that work really hard, they do so many bad shows, especially in Toronto, because it's not like every show is floated with audiences. You do a lot of bad mics where there are like 8 or 9 people, and then a lot of the mics, open mics specifically, they're in front of other comedians that are waiting for their turn. Right. Not in like a rude way, but that's just the way all comedians are. They're constantly thinking about their act. So you have to perform in front of people with their arms crossed, or, you know, you're performing in front of someone that's like writing their joke and figuring out their set list. And then you're doing your set. And then if you get a laugh from someone who just picks up their pencil for a second and goes, ha 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 ha, you're like, okay, I could use that bit. So when you come from doing that type of performance, and then I go to a theater show, and everyone, you know, there's not the Leafs game. I'm not performing with the Leafs game behind me. I'm performing in a place where the lighting is changing. They're not ambushed with a show, and people have paid to see the show. And on top of that, anytime I kind of am struggling with this show specifically, there's video too, and the video is it's so real. It's such a visceral experience watching it. So just I mean, the challenge is like staying alive and performing with commitment and intention with every line. But if I can hit all the lines, then I feel like, and especially because the show is just stuff that has happened to me, it's really difficult. As long as I'm just being open, that it will come out honestly. That's my hope. But of course, like there's definitely been shows where I've been nervous and I was like really in my head about like hitting the lines and hitting my marks. But even in those shows, there's moments where, you know, I open up and I discover something, and I think this, even when I want the show at a point where even if you were to read it and watch the video, you would take so much from it, and that like my performance is an addition to all that.
Because one of the things, like as a solo performer that's done a few performances of my own show. Of course, the first time you're always like, the first couple of times you're like so like right there. I started to find that, I think, of course, we all have the performance where we don't, you know, we sort of go on autopilot. And I really learned that I had to connect with the audience right from the beginning. And it wasn't something that I'd ever really considered when I started creating the show, that I would be, that, you know, you have to connect with the audience as though they're your scene partner. And if I can't, you know, I'll have to make eye contact with a few people. And if I can't do that, or I don't do that, then I felt like the show suffered. Did you find connecting with the audience, or for you, is it very much the you in the video?
I definitely need to, like, for me, like, I feel like if you're getting laughs, then that's like the receipt of connecting. So that's why I don't even, you could call it insecurity too, to get that type of laughter. 'Cause, when you do stand up, you have to think of like, well, you try to get momentum in your act. So the classic joke is like, I know what you're all thinking. I look like X had sex with Y, you know? And so it's like, what do I look like? I look like, a hipster Jackie Chan or whatever racist thing that people are saying. So I think, especially before, I mean, I think now it's a little bit different where you don't have to comment like that, and especially in certain rooms. But even in like 2012, you would have to think, well, what is people's first instincts? What is people's first impulse? Because you want to connect with everyone, even those that aren't accustomed to seeing someone that looks like you performing. So even with my show, I because I've done a bunch of stand up, even when, a host would introduce me and they would be like, and they'd be like, Franco, Nguyen, it's Nguyen. I'm so sorry. It's Franco. And then I would have to be like, man, thanks, man. He nailed it this time, or something, improvising something, because I'm realizing that there's something that it's like a picture that's not aligned, this guy just shook up the room and I have to like feng shui it for him. So yeah, for me, I definitely want to connect with the audience, and this show, I'm talking to people and I'm telling them the story. So anytime there's a certain reaction or there's a big laugh in a part that usually doesn't get a laugh, I have the freedom to say it. And if I have the impulse to say it, then I'm going to follow that impulse. And if I'm following it, that means I'm reacting to someone that's saying something. And because I'm reacting to them, then that means I'm connecting with them. And if the audience is laughing, then they also realize that I'm seeing something that they see.
Yes. Yeah. So how did the show come to Cahoots?
Well, I know Byron and Daryl, and we're extremely close friends. And they've had a relationship with Cahoots, and I've always known Marjorie around. I've seen her around. She's come to some of the Asian exploitation shows back in the day too. And Marjorie, I think she came to our Fringe show just to be supportive, and a bunch of people from Cahoots came, and the theater community is very supportive, and they came because of Byron and Daryl, and I think maybe because of me. Then they wanted to work with us early on, and then we developed the show a little bit more at Next Stage, and they were like, we wanted to be very early on, before I even went to Next Stage, they were like, we want it to be a part of either this season or one of our future seasons, because we love the show so much. And that's essentially it. We've always known each other, and they came to the show and they loved the show, and the show was doing well. And now we have a chance to do the official world premiere with like a big, it's not going to be Michael Bay explosions, but it's going to be a lot more than having to strike 5 minutes before.
So you did it at the Toronto Fringe, and then Next Stage. How much time was between Fringe and Next Stage?
It was the summer of the Fringe, and then it would be the fall. So it was like July. It's like right after. Yeah.
Were you carrying momentum from Fringe into did you find that a lot of people who didn't get to see it at Fringe were coming to Next Stage, or do you think it was a whole new audience?
It felt like a new audience. It felt like a different audience, because, even in our Fringe run, it was like, it was at the Theater Passe Muraille, so it was a smaller space, so not a lot. But it was also downtown. It was a summer audience. I don't know if even an audience member going from summer to winter, I feel like it's a different person.
You're not wrong.
Yeah.
You usually, there's a lot more layers involved in winter theater.
Yeah. And it seems like it's harder for people to come out. Whereas,
because in the summer, you're probably already out. You went, you don't mind walking home, whatever.
There's AC.
Yeah. And in the winter, you're like, you go from work to home, and you're just like burrowing under whatever covers you have to keep warm and cozy, right? Yeah.
So it definitely felt like a new audience. And I think what I like is that so many people have connected with the show. You don't necessarily have to be Vietnamese to really understand this feeling of miscommunication with your parents, or a sense of loneliness and alienation. I think a lot of people, I think that's the benefit of doing this one-person show, and that's what was missing in the process of editing the documentary, which was like this personal touch, because I think that's what it was before. It was like, oh, I'm watching a woman cry, versus I'm watching my friend Franco's mom cry, or I'm watching myself, or I see my that woman is my mother, and I see myself in Franco, or I see myself in Franco's mother, and I see Franco as my son, or there's more of a connection. And you don't necessarily need to be Vietnamese and living with your mom to connect.
I'm interested in that the alienation, the sort of the loneliness that you were feeling. Did your brother speak Vietnamese? Were you the one child that didn't, or did you both? Have difficulty communicating?
We both had difficulty communicating, and I think, we both had difficulty communicating. So even that's the other thing too, where it's like that was the beautiful aspect about the show was a lot of my friends who I grew up with, we never talk about our parents, and I think it's always because people, especially my friends who have immigrant parents, really feel like their parents have done a lot, and they feel like their parents, because they owe something to their parents and they haven't lived up to it. And in some cases it's like there was a lot of pressure and they couldn't live up to it, and so I think a lot of times we don't talk about it, one, because it's like there's other aspects like, oh, let's just watch the basketball game, man. And the other thing is like, man, if I start talking about how I feel about my parents, I might just start crying, and it's like I'm just trying to watch the playoffs. So me and my brother didn't speak Vietnamese that well either, and so even my brother actually never went to Vietnam. So when he came to the show, it was like, because he moved out and I was still living with my mom. So when he came to the show, he's like, it was kind of really emotional, because like even after the first show, it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that's what Vietnam was like. I also, there's a point in the show where I discover like I had a grandfather, and I never even talk about my grandfather. And my brother's like, oh my gosh, like all the things I'm experiencing in Vietnam, he hasn't even experienced. Right? Yeah. So, after the show, we leave, and then there's a huge crowd, and I see my brother out. Like I don't usually even hug my brother, but like, we hug each other, and it was very emotional. I was like getting choked up, and we started talking more, and we hang out more. He just had a baby, so but before that, we didn't speak to our parents that well in Vietnamese, but we also didn't really talk to each other as much. And we both speak English.
There was a point where difference in age between the two of you?
No, that's the weird thing. We're both he was only 2 years older than me. So, and I feel like that's the other thing about the show is like I felt like I was like articulating a lot of feelings that people who I grew up with didn't have the ability to articulate, or maybe they didn't have the opportunity. And I felt like I was. It is a very privileged position to, as Spider-Man says, great power comes great responsibility. And I had like an opportunity to, be honest and say things that I felt like a lot of people, were like a lot of sadness. A lot of people that I know are carrying. And it's like when you say these things out loud, a lot of the stress and the sadness, and the weight, of carrying a secret is the fact that it's a secret, is that you don't have anyone to talk to. So you feel like that's where the loneliness comes. But if you're like, oh, actually, I'm going to share this crazy thought with the world. And then people are like, I'm crazy too. And it's like, oh my gosh, we're all crazy. Yeah. Wait, if we're all crazy, then that's the normal. Yeah. So we're all normal. And so it was really nice to have people I grew up with from like high school and elementary to be like, man, like, I didn't know, like my friend Lang was like, I didn't know anything about you. Like, I've never even been to your house. And we've known each other since like 7th grade, so it was cool. Yeah. And it was nice. And even artistically going from stand-up where you feel the need to get a laugh every like few seconds or so. To do this show and have huge pockets, like in stand-up, you have your laugh breaks and you have your applause breaks. And that's like, man, I just got 7 applause breaks, man, I crushed that. Yeah. But in this show, because it's so honest, there was a moment that I found where people would get really sad and I would hear like sniffles and it was like, oh, it was a cry break. It's pretty sweet. But it is cool because it makes you realize that I think part of stand-up too is like there's an insecurity about, not for all stand-ups, but for me personally, it's that I need to get a laugh so I know that I'm connecting, so that I'm not being too vulnerable. But I think with a one-person show and with theater, when people aren't forced to buy beer, it changes the atmosphere where people are like, no, I want to, you're allowed to go as vulnerable as you want because people are there to connect with every single emotion. Whereas, you know, if you go to a comedy club, you have to, having 2 beers, people might not want to experience that emotion when they're out on a Friday night drinking 2 beers. But
they're
when
just
you're
trying to have a good time.
Yeah. But in the theater show, it's like a different type of good time.
It's very different.
Yeah.
Was it that was the laugh, the like having to have a laugh every so often, was that a difficult impulse to break with this show?
Yeah, I think it was definitely because I was very insecure about, like I said before, it's like if the laughter is kind of like a receipt for connecting, and I was like, oh, if people aren't laughing, maybe they're not connecting. And I was very worried about being self-indulgent. But I think that's the benefit of having a team of people that you trust and that you really admire. So Byron and Daryl definitely helped pull out, and because they're such great actors and they have a great theater experience that I didn't have, they were able to be like, no, if this is what you're feeling here, then you have to be truthful to this. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Feeling here, then you have to be truthful to what you're feeling. And you don't need to put in a punchline here. And I'm like, okay, I'll trust you. And then it works, and then you feel it. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's interesting because the theater audience lets you know that they are not engaged in some very different ways than a comedy audience, I would imagine. Yeah. Because, you're with a comedy audience, if they're not laughing, they're not engaged, and maybe they'll start talking to each other or whatever. But a theater audience, it's when they start moving.
Oh, interesting. I've never noticed that. Yeah.
For me, it's like if I notice that there's a lot of people who are like shifting in their seat or whatever, it's like, oh, we're losing them. You can sort of see as soon as people start like looking in other places, like if you can watch the audience and you sort of see a lot of movement, you're like, okay, I gotta pull these people in somehow.
Oh man, I'm gonna be watching out for that. I didn't know that.
I've spent a lot. I used to work as an usher in a theater, and so I watched audiences a lot.
Oh,
you can learn a lot about an audience.
Yeah, it's like that thing when my friend was telling me, like some film editors, or filmmakers, they'll put, when they show their rough cut, they'll put food in the middle. So like the moment when people reach for the food to eat, it's when they're really bored. Yeah. So yeah.
That's a good trick.
Yeah.
So it's those litmus tests. It's like, how do you find out like when people are, because people won't always tell you.
No. Yeah. That's the thing.
That they're drifting, right? You have to know what they're, how to see what they're actually thinking.
Yeah. I'm very insecure about that. Like, I always feel like, oh, was that good? Was that good? And then I really definitely over-examine what people say and what their compliments are. Or, because if someone's like rushing out, I'm like, okay, they didn't like the show. They're like, okay, I'll see it later. Or if someone's like, oh, I liked it. Are you
judging like are they enthusiastic enough, or are you trying to like find what's the subtext of I liked it?
I think it's always paired with how you feel about the show. Because I feel pretty honest with myself, but I do feel like I don't know if at times I'm too hard on myself or if I'm basking in the feeling of something undeserved. I think that's my bigger fear. So I always feel like when someone's saying something, whatever the compliment is, I'm like, okay. Oh, you thought it was interesting. That's interesting. I don't know.
It is funny how we can do that to ourselves as performers.
Yeah.
Because we're actually terrible judges of our own performance.
Yeah.
The audience there are so many things that an audience will do that tells you how they felt about it, but we get caught up in our own, like, how do I feel about this? Oh, this moment wasn't as good as like last night or whatever. We get into our heads about that, and sometimes the audience is being completely honest with us about how much they love it, and we can't let our own thing go.
I still don't. I mean, there's times where I feel like when it's very obvious, where I'm like, man, that was a good one, and then everyone's like, yeah, that was so great, and everyone's walking up to you. Yeah. But then there's I don't know. Then there's other times when I don't know. I guess it's like you do get used to the material, so you have to remember that your sense of discovery and surprise is different than someone else's.
That is a very important thing to remember, because you discovered it once and it was like so amazing. Yeah. And after the same thing for so long, you start to want to futz with it. Yeah. When really, you have to remember that the audience, they're experiencing it for the first time, like you did once.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially you don't want to get into like, I already know this, so I'm going to add this other thing to make it interesting for me. Right. But it'd be so confusing for them. Exactly.
Or maybe it's for you and your stage manager, but that's not. That's not the audience. Yeah. Since you've done this, you did this at Fringe, you did this at Next Stage, and now you're coming back to it for this sort of larger scale performance. Yeah. And when I came in here, there were a lot of people. For a second, I was like, I thought this was a one-person show. Yeah. But that's like your team. Yeah. And what does rehearsal look like for this show now?
Yeah. Well, it's like a newer show, right? So it's not the same show, because the last two shows where you have to strike in 15 minutes. And especially coming back to this show, and it's less coming back, but like, just showing it to the world. It's because it does feel like a new premiere of it. I did rewrite a bunch of parts and tweak a bunch of parts and add some stuff, and the beginning and ending chunks are like, there's chunks of the beginning and ending are different, and there's chunks of the show that are different, and there's video that wasn't there before. Okay. So it is a new show. So the rehearsal process for this is a little bit more, we have a little bit more time. But because certain, like the parts that I do know a little bit that were in the previous shows, you can be a little bit more precise with the rehearsal. And because it's a little bit more, there's more pieces to it, you just have to be a little bit more on point. Like in the Fringe debut, that I had the script on the stage. Like it was taped to the wall, and I was like, all right, going to Vietnam part. All right. And I was just like, sometimes I would be freestyling. I'm like, okay, here's an idea. And I think that version was just like, okay, move to the left, move to the right. Whereas this version, we have an idea, there's more to it. We know what we're trying to say with it. So it's a more thought out, explored, it's an emotional show, and I think what we're trying to communicate is much clearer. So so because of all that, it is a new show. Nice. Yeah.
Franco, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was so fun.
This has been a Homebody Productions production.